Hey, what is up, everybody? This is Stevie Breach coming to you here today. We are driving home after dropping the kiddies off at school. This video is going to be about Brian Pillman, the loose cannon. I was able to watch his documentary on the WWE Network last night. Honestly, I think probably in the last month, I made a video on the Life and Times of Mr. Perfect release that came out. And at the beginning of that one, I sort of did a disclaimer that honestly, I don't think I ever would have thought of this unless it was listening to the Wrestling Observer and heard Dave Meltzer talk about the Owen Hart DVD before its release. And that's been at least a year, maybe even 2 years. And that still sticks with me. And that basically is talking about the fact that WWE made DVDs like Brian Pillman, Mr. Perfect, Owen Hart, sort of to make money on the light of the way they passed. That basically they didn't live a full life. They died before their times were up. You can debate that Mr. Perfect passed away at the twilight end of his careers. No doubt he would have found a place to wrestle, maybe for TNA or kept doing independence. But the way that Owen died, still in WWE, even though he was looking for a way out, and the way that Brian Pillman passed, the day before a pay-per-view, that they passed before they were done, and WWE is cashing in on the way. And if you look at it as if they wouldn't have died the way they would have all three been looked at as really good wrestlers for their time. But of the three, none of them were world heavyweight champions. They never supported the WWF. They were not main event guys. And you can go out there and you can debate that WWE has not done biography DVD releases on bigger names that are out there. That being said, the Brian Pillman DVD, which was released around 2005 or maybe even 2006, honestly is a really good documentary. It talks about his life in times in WCW, ECW, WWE. From listening to the Wrestling Observer podcast for so long, Brian Pillman, stayed in contact with a lot of big names in the world of professional wrestling, and one of those names was Dave Meltzer. And him and Dave talked about a lot of things. And one of the things that Brian was always really conflicted on was how to become a bigger name in the world of wrestling. In WCW, he just was not ever satisfied with where he was on the card. And honestly, when he looked at the main event scene, he wanted to honestly really have Lex Luger's spot. And he felt that if he found a way for WCW to pay him more money, they would be forced to use him in a bigger spot to make the money that they were paying him make sense. And those are some of the big stories that you see in this documentary, is always trying to find a way to get the spotlight on him, to make him a bigger name, to help wrestling, and lots of things like that. The story started off with Brian Pillman sort of being a miracle baby that spent a lot of time at the doctor and in the hospital when he was born. A lot of people didn't think that he would survive, and that sort of became his sticking point throughout life. He just kept pushing and kept pushing. He was a really good football player who basically was looked at as an all-American high school talent, but for one reason or another, people thought he was too small to play on the defensive line, and he was one of the guys that was not offered a scholarship to go off and play college ball. But he ended up going to the University of Miami, Ohio, where he would still be a standout from there, where he would go on to be undrafted, but he would find a way to the Cincinnati Bengals, where he would have a great year playing special teams for them as the guy that would sort of run downfield and sort of break up blocks on kickoff and punt returns. And he showed a lot of heart to the point where the Cincinnati Bengals, the players of the team, voted him the Courage Award. Although he was not able to stick on with the Bengals, he ended up trying out for another team, not making it. That sent him to play in the Canadian Football League, where he went on to play in Calgary. In Calgary is where he basically got hooked up with the Hearts because of the being in the world of professional wrestling, and that is where he started training to become a wrestler, as well as being in what was the Calgary Stampede is the name of the football team. I can't remember what the name of the Bruce Hart's wrestling company that was up there, but that basically is the same company that Brett, Owen, the British Bulldogs all came out of to be big stars in the WWF, and that's where he was one of the shining points of being there. From there, he ends up going to WCW, where he ends up, probably the biggest thing he ever did was, be the light heavyweight champion, which was the title that, they brought out. It ended up becoming the cruiserweight belt down the road after sort of, they sort of took this road of making this something, and then they sort of dropped the idea and then picked it up a couple years later when they started bringing in all the Mexican talent and things, and Nitro really took off down the line. But yeah, he was the first ever light heavyweight champion, and that was sort of a bargaining chip for WCW, because he had signed sort of a bigger contract, but Bill Watts wanted to knock it down. And the funny story, basically, Brian Pillman was offered, we'll make you a champion and show you, what it's like to be a star, or you can keep the money and we'll beat you every night. And he said that he was going to become the highest paid jobber of all time. And that is exactly what happened. I can honestly remember a storyline in WCW that was not talked about on the documentary, which to me was a big storyline, but maybe in the grand scheme of things, and I can't really find anything about it online. But Brian Pillman lost a retirement angle match, where I believe it was a tag team match. I know Elegante was in it, Brian Pillman, I can't remember who else was in it, but Pillman ended up taking the pin and he had to retire. And shortly after that has been something like the Yellow Dog or the Cat Dog, a guy that looked just like Pillman, and the announcers even would bring that up, would come out and wrestle under a mask. And I honestly don't know where that went, but Brian Pillman ended up finding a way to come back. He had the big storyline angle with Kevin Sullivan, where he did the whole Booker Man thing, and that's sort of where the loose cannon thing was built. He ended up, sort of running that into becoming a member of the Four Horsemen, running with Arn Anderson and Ric Flair, and he was just honestly a real wild man at this point, trying to do any scheme that he could do to try and get, publicity on himself. At one point, he was going to go to the Super Bowl, which was held in the Georgia Dome in Atlanta, and he was going to run out on the field, and he was going to handcuff himself to the goalpost, thinking that, they would have nothing but to do but show him as the reason why the game would not be going on. And of course, he would be wearing some WCW or Brian Pillman sort of, I guess you could say, gear or printed sweatshirt or something, to the point where he would get publicity from this, or maybe the story would come out that he works for WCW, and that would make the loose cannon character in WCW worth more. He was not able to acquire a ticket to the Super Bowl for the reason that he was telling people what his plan was, and people figured that it would get back to them, as they were the one that gave Brian Pillman the ticket, and then they would not be invited to the Super Bowl in future years down the road. The one story that is sort of glossed over here is that, WCW wanted Brian Pillman to become a big star, and one of the reasons why he wanted to become a big star was actually to leave the company and go wrestle for ECW. And Brian Pillman actually tricked WCW into giving him his release, basically saying that if the story was not real, if there was not paperwork that was filed, that nobody would buy into it. And that is basically where the storyline came, where Pillman was released while wrestling in ECW. And then he was able to sign his contract with the WWF. While wrestling in ECW, before signing that contract with WWF, he was involved in a car crash while he was driving his Hummer down the road, and it was a bad accident where he was basically flung from the vehicle. He major problems to his ankle. His wife even says that his foot was completely 180 degrees turned around to that point. And this is something that, bothered him for the rest of his, career. It was the pain and not being able to, have the movement that he'd had. They brought him in and he still used him in WWF, thinking that the ankle would heal and that he would become a big performer for them and become a big star, where he did a lot of commentating teams. He did a lot of, in-ring interviews, and just pushed the angle. Once he was finally able to come back, he had a small feud with Stone Cold Steve Austin. He ended up joining the Hart Foundation, which is one of the things that most people remember him for, the part that he was with until his dying day. One of the biggest matches he was ever in was in the Canadian Stampede. But, that sort of draws up his career as a whole, honestly. I mean, Brian Pillman was a great wrestler, but I'm not really popping in, matches of his to see from back in the day. It was great that he got his own, documentary. I'm sure that his family received royalties for the DVD being sold and things like that. And, many promoters for a couple of years after he had passed away, did Brian Pillman memorial shows and things like that. And even David Arquette, when he did wrestling after Ready to Rumble, he donated his WCW money to the Brian Pillman family to keep them afloat and keep them going. So it's a strange story what happened to him. A lot of people don't even really know that it wasn't drugs that brought down Brian Pillman, but it just was that he just died. And it just is what it is. Even WCW went on their hotline and said that he had overdosed on drugs, something that they would have to later come back out and say that they were wrong about and didn't mean to report. But it's a weird story. Brian Pillman, the loose cannon. If you haven't seen it by now, make sure you check it out on the WWE Network.